We're on part 15 of my respectful rebuttal of Richard Gage's 9/11 video, Blueprint for Truth. Richard Gage asserts that Building 7 had a nearly symmetrical collapse. What he can say truthfully would be the collapse of the upper half of the north face looks pretty clean. But that face twisted toward the end, rotated southwards, and the north face developed a visible kink off center as the column failures progressed outwards from the initial point of failure. So there was no symmetry in any horizontal direction. Controlled demolitions don't always produce symmetrical collapses. If there are structures close to one side of the building, they make the building fall the other way. Richard Gage asserts that a natural fire collapse would topple like buildings in an earthquake because fire creates asymmetrical damage. But is this true? The Delft University tower collapse of 2008 was natural. It went almost straight down because gravity is a natural force that tends to pull things straight down unless a lateral force pushes it sideways. Here is the video of the tall, steel-framed structure with concrete reinforcement, in this case, of the Delft collapse again, to remind you that a natural collapse can and does fall mostly straight down because of gravity, and that this is how there's the history of tall, steel-framed buildings collapsing that is now a little bigger than it was in 2001. There is also a European demolition company called Ferrari Dominique, which uses a technique of controlled demolition where they yank a couple floors out horizontally using strong cables from the ground going up at a 45-degree angle. There is no pre-weakening of the rest of the structure, so it is safe for use in earthquake-prone areas where traditional demolition preparation would be too unstable. The cables pull the building so that some vertical bits break or are pulled out from between the remaining structure. The horizontal force applied by yanking the 45-degree cables is about 2/3 of the total force, and that lateral force is small compared to the weight of the upper portion of the building. It is overwhelmed by the parts of the building not attacked by the varanage. Even with this horizontal pull from one side, the building falls mostly straight down. Notice too that the kinetic energy of the top 3 floors completely destroys the fully intact 9 floors below. I have just heard a new argument against natural collapse, where 9/11 truth researchers quote architect Mario Salvadori from 1980 about tall buildings, who says, quote, "The load on the columns increases with the number of floors of the building, and their weight must vary in the same proportion." Using this line of reasoning, 9/11 truth researchers compare a tall building to a pyramid, where most of the weight is at the bottom. Therefore, the argument goes, the top of a tall building would be lighter and unable to plow through the heavier lower floors. The 2008 Delft University straight-down fast collapse of the top half of a tall building due to fire proves this wrong. The top is lighter, but as Salvadori says, quote, "their weight must vary in the same proportion." In essence, on any given floor, there must be at least 3 times the weight-bearing capacity of the floors above it. That requires less absolute strength and weight for the upper floors, but each floor must have at least 3 times its weight-bearing capacity, so the relative strength of the building is similar, floor by floor. Richard Gage talked about the buildings following what was the path of greatest resistance downward. Richard claims that all objects follow the path of least resistance, but that path is limited by which paths are actually available. An object can't just move itself sideways because the tower resistance would be lower there. What Richard is saying is that the tops of the twin towers should have floated to the side and into midair and then drop over just because it would be the path of least resistance. A little bit like this right here. If this is the tower and it kind of goes this way and drops, well, there's no force that pushes it over here so that it can drop down like that. With the twin towers, that kind of lateral force would have to be great enough to move 180 million pounds, hundreds of feet into the air. And even a jet crashing into the building didn't have that kind of force. This Colorado River carved itself through a gradually uplifting mountain over millions of years, plowing itself through a path of least resistance down the middle of a growing mountain. Like the tops of the twin towers, this river couldn't just jump over to a path of much less resistance, over to a nearby flat surface a few miles away from the mountain. It plowed through the solid granite because the flatter path just was not available to it, any more than the open air off to the side was available for many of the beams in the collapsing twin towers. This liquid river will take the path of least available vertical resistance, but to be more precise, solid objects move according to the forces exerted on them. I'll repeat that. Solid objects move according to the forces exerted on them. And if there's no force to produce a movement in a particular direction, there will be no movement in that direction. If a brick falls on an egg, will it move to the side because that's the path of least resistance? No, the brick's own mass gives it a resistance to lateral movement that's greater than the resistance of the egg to vertical movement. Gravity tends to pull things straight down, even through resistance. In order for anything to fall sideways, the structure has to generate a large enough lateral force. It's a simple example of conservation of momentum. An inclined plane, if it does not collapse, can do this. But the World Trade Center force gradient was only in one direction, straight down. That is the path of least resistance to a gross order. Now, zooming in a bit, we can see that the buildings did fall through the path of least resistance that was available to them. The path of greatest resistance is where all the columns above strike all the columns below, both axially and simultaneously. This did not occur in the Twin Towers. The top sections tilted before the remaining structure progressively collapsed. In Building 7, where the collapse of the inside of the building eventually dragged the perimeter walls inward, most of the falling material bypassed or bounced away from those columns. Large sheets of perimeter wall and aluminum cladding were pushed outward and hit Building 7. Objects also fell downward into the vast open office spaces themselves. The North Tower did not fall as quickly through the path of greatest resistance. The core. A large part of the core still stood several seconds after the rest had collapsed. That's because the core had more strength, and when possible falling objects deflected away from it and into the open office space, the overall collapse just kept finding the weakest link. What does Richard think should have happened if falling roughly straight down doesn't meet his expectations? If you think about it, there really isn't much other choice, is there? Thomas Eiger stated, quote, "The building is 95% air and can implode into itself. A 200,000-ton structure has too much inertia to fall in any direction other than nearly straight down." And Michael Brown states, "The buildings did not fall down perfectly straight. Their collapses were tilted toward the weakened collapse points." If it were controlled demolition, it wouldn't tilt 6 degrees like this prior to its collapse. This is a photo of a building undergoing progressive structural decay due to fire. There was no visible or auditory sign of explosion directly triggering collapse. No explosive squibs flew out. Building 7 was a squat building, wider than it was high. Even less likely that symmetrical destruction would happen, as even greater lateral forces would be required. One of the perimeter walls folded whole on top of everything else. World Trade Center didn't fall into its own footprint in Building 7. There was extensive damage to Fiderman Hall and $1.4 billion damage to the Verizon building. If classic controlled demolition were happening, they would fall much more neatly into their own footprint. Debris flew 16 acres around. The Verizon building, as I said, had $1.4 billion in damage. Does Richard have any other examples of successful controlled demolitions that were this sloppy? Richard talks about the convenient sizes of the broken column pieces, which, by the way, were similar to the size of the original pieces prior to assembly. But has he ever talked to a first responder who said there was anything convenient about the removal of the World Trade Center rubble? I have, and 9/11 hero and firefighter Vincent Palmieri emailed me this picture and personally told me that, quote, "Richard Gage has claimed in his presentations that the steel columns were conveniently broken into 30-foot pieces by the thermitic destruction for easy and quick removal. As a first responder, I can assure you that there was nothing convenient about the debris pile we encountered in the fall of 2001. Such a claim is absolutely inaccurate." Controlled demolition advocates have told me that the nanothermitic explosions would not have gone off until triggered by a radio signal, even at very high temperatures. Now, the original 2001 Tillotson study found that real nanothermite ignites at 985 degrees Fahrenheit. Niels Harret's 2009 Trade Center dust sample, which Harret, Gage, and others claim is also nanothermite, ignited even earlier around 825 degrees Fahrenheit. So AE 911's own science source proves that nanothermite or thermite could never survive even moderate office fires. That's why even former controlled demolition employee and 9/11 activist Tom Sullivan says this would be impossible. And what kind of radio receiver would survive the raging fires at the crash points and receive a radio signal to trigger the collapse at precisely the right time? There are some differences among the collapses in the 3 buildings. They didn't collapse straight into their own footprint. In Tower 2, the jet hit the building at more of an angle and then caused this building to fall in a somewhat asymmetrical way, where the top tilted a bit and then followed the rest of the building's path to complete collapse. Fires got hot enough to cause the steel to lose its structural strength. There are many websites that talk about this. Type in fracture and deformation of materials in your favorite search engine. The horizontal steel beams expanded, then bowed downward because of resistance of the perimeter walls and the massive gravitational forces that were pulling them downward in the middle. The steel beams, bowing downward as the heat softened the steel, pulled the buildings inward as they collapsed. In Building 7, smoke was pouring out of most of the side of the building facing the now-destroyed World Trade Center towers. There was resistance to vertical fire spread, but the fireproofing may have been compromised in the southwest corner from the debris damage. And NIST says the building was eventually no match for the flames that raged out of control for several hours after the firefighters were unable to pour any more water on it. Near the end of the 7 hours of burning, NIST says the fires probably jumped from floor to floor. In part 15 of our Respectful Rebuttal, we'll look at the compelling eyewitness accounts around Building 7 and evidence of foreknowledge of the building's destruction. Thank you again for watching.